Okay, here's another feminist. I thought this was funny and worth reacting to. The Quran doesn't say women need to wear hijab.
Bring me the Quranic verse that tells us that we have to wear the hijab. And don't get, because I'm going...
Bring me the Quranic verse that tells you have to wear hijab. Okay, well, here it is. And tell the believing women to reduce some of their vision and guard their private parts and not expose their adornment except that which necessarily appears thereof, and to wrap a portion of their head covers over their chests and not to expose their adornment. بِخُمُرِهِمْ بِخُمُرِهِنْ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنْ. That's the command. That's hijab. Khumr is the plural of khimar, which means head cover. That's hijab. This is the verse of the Quran.
Of course! It was so obvious!
Pop quiz. According to the command, cover your chests with your khumr, what should be covered? And note, this is not a trick question. Is it A, the chest? Is it B, the head? Is it C, SpongeBob SquarePants? Or D, the Muslim skeptic's last remnants of common sense and logic? If you answered A, you would be correct. But if you answered D, I would also accept that. If you answered C, don't feel too bad, as this answer is no less ridiculous as option B, which is what Daniel chose. Poor Daniel, he gets the dunce's hat for that answer. I mean, seriously, Daniel, did you flunk primary school listening and comprehension? In what universe is such a clear and concise command to cover the chest somehow reinterpreted to mean cover the head? Wait. You're going to tell me that this command is contained in the mere mentioning of a word that allegedly means head cover, right?
بِخُمُرِهِمْ بِخُمُرِهِنْ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنْ. That's the command. That's hijab. Khumr is the plural of khimar, which means head cover. That's hijab.
That is, saying cover your bosom with your head covers means that covering the head is already a given, yes? I know that's what it is, because it's the same rationale that all the other compulsory hijab proponents use, and the only explanation that has any semblance of logic. Well, let's put that little piece of attempted logic to the test, shall we? Let's take an analogy. Now, any native English speaker will be familiar with the phrase, put a sock in it. Which literally means, put a sock in your mouth. Which is something you say to someone who is annoying you, so that they stop talking. Because, you can't talk with a sock in your mouth. Now, if we were to apply the same logic as traditionalists apply to verse 24:31, to advocate compulsory hijab, one literally has to put the sock on their foot, before they can put it in their mouth. Why? Just let the traditionalists explain it themselves.
يضربن بخمرهن. What is خمرهن? خمر الخمار is a piece of cloth that usually covers the hair. Once I say khimar, that means the hair is covered.
They should take their khimar, which we already said it means what? Head covering. It's already on the head. So the Quran is already assuming that you're covering your hair. It's already assumed.
So now we understand, because the khimar is supposedly a quote-unquote head cover, specifically intended for the head, then it must literally be already on the head before anything else is done to it, such as using it to cover the bosom. So, if someone is told to put a sock in their mouth, an item of clothing that is specifically intended for the foot, they therefore, ipso facto, must put it on their foot, before they put it in their mouth. And then, taking this to its logical conclusion, we can explain to the person putting the sock in the mouth, that the point of the command was not so much to put a sock in the mouth, but rather, the whole point of the exercise was to get you to put the sock on your foot. See how absurd this logic really is? And yet, we have apparently intelligent people advocating this logic with a completely straight face. It's just hilarious. But at the risk of allow me to further illustrate this point, using evidence that the traditionalists can't possibly dismiss. A so-called Sahih narrative from their beloved Hadith corpus. This narrative describes a companion arriving at a woman's house to fetch some bread to give to the Prophet. The woman then wraps the bread in a khimar. That's right, the same khimar traditionalists insist can only be used for wearing on the head. She then puts that bread under the companion's arm and wraps it around his waist. Presumably so that it was secure for the journey. In this situation, the use of the khimar is very clear. Namely, that the khimar was used as a regular cover or blanket to wrap some bread so that it could be transported. We can imagine it was much like in this demonstration. Here we can see the khimar can have a purpose that has nothing to do with covering the head. And the evidence for this is none other than the traditionalists' own sacred scripture, namely the Hadith. It doesn't mean it can't be used as a head cover in other situations. But it clearly shows that just because the word khimar is mentioned, it isn't necessarily referring to covering the head, as the traditionalists would insist. Just imagine if the traditionalists interpreted this hadith the same way as they interpret verse 24:31, that is, the so-called khimar verse of the Quran. Whereby, they would insist that the bread cannot possibly be wrapped up by a khimar, unless it was firstly on the woman's head. That would be just stupid, and not even the traditionalists would advocate that. No, rather, this hadith just proves the point, that it is perfectly conceivable that even if the Quran mentions the word khimar, it isn't necessarily in the context of covering the head. Especially, if the Quran doesn't even mention the head, and rather uses the word in the context of covering something else. Put simply, if a khimar can be used to cover bread, without it simultaneously being on the head, then it can easily be used to cover the chest area, also without simultaneously being on the head. For example, like this. And now for just one final point. I'll note that in his video, Daniel, smugly, references Lane's lexicon as his authority to try and prove that the word khimar means a woman's head covering.
If you have any doubts about what the Quran is referring to, go to the dictionaries. Go to the Arabic dictionary. Go to Lane's lexicon, for example. Here is a screenshot from Lane's lexicon about khimar, the word that we just saw. We saw khumr, which is the plural of khimar. And here it is. Khimar, a woman's muffler or veil with which she covers her head and the lower part of her face, leaving exposed only the eyes and part or the whole of the nose. And then the plural is khumr. See at the bottom, I highlighted that.
But in a twist that I'm sure will shock you all, Daniel is being completely dishonest here. This is the same screenshot that Daniel was referencing for the word khimar. Oh, and what have we here? It seems that according to Lane, there is another definition of khimar. We can see it right here, where it says, any covering of a thing, anything by which a thing is veiled, or covered. So clearly, there are two different definitions of khimar, one a specific head covering, and one a non-specific, generic cover that can be used for any sort of covering. Gosh, I wonder why Daniel didn't mention that. So how can the traditionalists insist that this reference to khumr in the Quran is not referencing this generic cover as opposed to the specific head cover? Well, they can't. They just can't. It's as simple as that. I mean, how could they? It is literally the only time the word is mentioned in the entire Quran. So it cannot be compared with other uses in the Quran. The Quran just doesn't give any context or explanation of what it means by the word. So funky Quran guy, the traditionalists don't have any evidence that the Quran is referring to a head cover, I hear you ask. Oh, of course they have evidence. Evidence in the form of misogynistic so-called Islamic scholars, such as Ibn Kathir, writing some 4 to 5 centuries after the Quran was revealed, who give their utterly baseless tafsirs on the Quran. Ibn Kathir, whose idea of a, properly, Islamically, dressed Muslim woman, involves a complete covering head to toe, including a full face veil, with one tiny hole for one eye. But as far as actual, real evidence, there is absolutely nothing. nothing whatsoever to suggest that the Quran is referring to a woman's head cover, as opposed to a generic cover for covering the bosom area. What arrogance, to insist otherwise, as the traditionalists do so emphatically. So clearly, this little detail from Lane's lexicon makes the argument by traditionalists that the Quranic reference to the khimar can only be referencing a head cover to go kind of like this. And that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for watching, and please put a comment and a like to this video. And subscribe to this channel to get updates on more videos.